Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on carbon reporting. Environmental sustainability is a serious challenge facing industry today. It's why we established our roadmap to sustainability at the end of 2020. It's an initiative led by our members for our members. Its purpose is to inform members on the key issues and provide a solid and strategic way forward on sustainability. More recently, our members have been asking about how to calculate and report their carbon emissions. Who is responsible for reporting which emissions, particularly when considering distribution? Is the transport of the product from the factory gate to the distributor's warehouse the responsibility of the manufacturer, distributor, or both? What's the right methodology to use to calculate emissions? Is it possible to compare emissions across products or between different organizations? Today's speakers will be answering these and other questions. The speakers are Andrew Griffiths, Director of Policy and Corporate Development at Planetmark, Greg Self, Founder and Managing Director of Nero, a consultancy that helps organizations measure and reduce their carbon footprints to the highest standards, and Ryan Stevens, Director of Business Development for Interface NRM, the UK's only employee-owned accredited certification and verification body. Andrew is going to discuss the importance of net zero, the purpose of carbon reporting, and Planetmark certification program. Greg will explain how to conduct carbon reporting and data collection, and Ryan will answer the question, why verify, and cover the verification process. We'll finish with Q&A, so please post your questions through the chat during the webinar. And now I'll hand over to Andrew.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lorcan, and lovely to be here with everyone. Do let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from today. It's always good to get to know who's tuning in and all that good stuff. And I'll be keeping an eye out for questions and stuff there throughout. So it falls to me to kind of kick things off with a bit of a carbon jargon buster. And I'm kind of curious, hopefully you can use the reaction button or the hand raise type thing to sort of say, who here is broadly comfortable that they understand what scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are, out of curiosity. See if there's any reactionary buttons or hand raising type things. Phil feels confident. Good. Yeah, Andrew. 2 Andrews. Josh. Wonderful. Good. Okay, a good range of you. All right. And okay, next question. Who feels like they could comfortably describe the difference between net zero and carbon neutral? I'm seeing less hands. But Phil, Josh, Nicholas, good. Arjun, feeling good. Okay, good. That's positive. That's good. But for those who don't feel comfortable, by the end of my session here, the goal is for you to really have an understanding of that. And so Laura can kindly introduce me, but one of the first things I always like to kick off with when talking about these things is just kind of a bit of a message of hope, which is basically to say, if you haven't started or you're fairly early onto your kind of carbon measurement and reduction journey, you absolutely can make significant progress in short spaces of time, right? And there is absolutely things you can do. It absolutely has a business benefit to do so. And Planetmark members, we certify over 800 organizations. And in the first 10 years of us measuring people, where we've been around since 2013, we've measured more than 800,000 tons of emission reductions. 98% of the organizations that we work with succeed in reducing their carbon footprint every single year. And on average, over that kind of time span, they've reduced by on an average of 10% per year in absolute terms and 14% per employee. So you can very much do this. And there's lots of great companies, and I can see some of the names. I think Evans Vanadine. Hi, Vicky. There's a whole bunch of cleaning industry members that Planetmark work with that you can see a whole array of things on here. And I'll try and sort of share a couple of practical examples from within the cleaning industry as we go through as well. But first things first. So what does net zero mean? So put simply, net zero is cutting greenhouse gas emissions as close to zero as possible, with any remaining emissions being reabsorbed from the atmosphere. But what does that mean kind of in practice is what we get into. And basically, the game we're all playing as a human society is we're trying to balance a set of scales, essentially. You can imagine it as a seesaw, right? And at the moment, we've got a lot of carbon sources, a lot of emissions going into the atmosphere, and we are actively undermining our carbon sinks, the things that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Think forest, think seagrass, think, peatland, and all of those sorts of things that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, right? And we're trying to rebalance these scales. And these scales are so far unbalanced at the moment that it's not possible for us to simply plant enough trees to counterbalance how much we're emitting. Yeah. And that is where the kind of concept of net zero comes from. And so when we talk about carbon emissions, and I'm not going to go into detail on the how you measure now, because Greg's going to be talking about that in a bit. But when you hear someone like me or someone like Greg or someone like Ryan talk about carbon emissions, just to be very clear, we do mean all of the greenhouse gases. We do mean methane, we do mean nitrous oxides, we do mean all of these things that you can see at the top of this slide. Because when we say it, what we mean is carbon dioxide equivalent, right? And what you'll see that written as CO2e in reports. And that's because as human beings, we don't particularly like complex KPIs and having lots of different numbers to manage. And so what scientists did is they calculated the heating effect on the planet of different gases, right? And so, for example, methane is like a much thicker blanket on the atmosphere. It has a much greater heating effect on the planet, but it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide does. And so based on those two things, sort of how severe and how much of a heating potential it has and the duration, they calculate a number that says, okay, on average, for every 1 ton of methane, it is equivalent to 25 tons of carbon dioxide. And so it's kind of 25. And that's how we end up at our lovely 1 carbon emissions figure. Then within that, you've got scopes 1 and 2. Scope one is essentially the fuel that you burn. So for most organizations, that will be if you have an oil or gas heating system, if you're making use of any fuels in any of your devices, if you have any kind of petrol powered kind of devices and things that you're using. And then if you own any vehicles, any company vehicle fleet that are petrol, diesel, or hybrid. And then scope 2 is the energy that you use. So that's if you are using electricity as part of powering an office, powering a manufacturing site, whatever that kind of looks like, right? And so combined for most organizations, scope 1 and 2 emissions are essentially their utility bills and their vehicle fleet if they have any, right? Which is a fairly straightforward thing. And the way I like to kind of put this is, imagine if I was saying to you that I personally am the most sustainable human being and I'm a hero of sustainability, and then you found out that the only thing that I'd measured to justify my aren't I wonderful kind of statement was my utility bills and my car, and I'd left out the food that I eat, the products that I buy, the places that I travel, the investments that I make, you might not think I've necessarily done enough to justify my claim, right? And the same is true for organizations, because when you get into scope 3 emissions, we're talking about everything else. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but essentially you've got stuff that's upstream of you and you've got stuff that's downstream of you. Imagine yourself in a river. Everything flowing to you, everything upstream of you, flowing towards you is everything you're buying. It's the services and the products that you're procuring. And everything downstream of you is what's happening to your products and services after they leave your business, how you transport them to your customer, how they are made use of, what happens to them at the end of life. Have you made them to be recyclable? Have you made them to be eco-friendly in how they're disposed of? So it's the kind of everything else concept. And for most organizations, scope 3 emissions will represent anywhere from 70% to 99.9% of their carbon footprint, right? It's a big chunk of the emissions. And that's what ends up looking roughly like this. So if you get a carbon footprint done, this is what it ends up looking like. This is a real company, and you can see the breakdown where you will find probably that some scope 3 emissions categories aren't relevant to you, right? But a lot of them will be. And so you calculate your footprint. And when you look at this footprint, you can then start to work out, okay, where can I have an impact? Because what net zero requires of us is basically that your scope 1 and 2 emissions, the fuel that you burn and the energy that you use, you've got to get to essentially zero. To achieve net zero, you've got to get that essentially to zero. And you're going to do that by purchasing renewable energy, by transitioning to an electric or hydrogen vehicle fleet, by pursuing energy efficiency measures. You've got to get that more or less essentially to zero, right? And then scope 3 emissions, you've got to get as close as possible to zero. You've got to do as much as you can. And the list of things you're going to do there be much longer. You're going to engage with your suppliers. You're going to have waste reduction measures, travel hierarchies, all that sort of thing. And then only the last little bit, what we call residual or unavoidable emissions, is what you can use accredited carbon offset removal schemes for. And so very quickly, I'm going to define those two types of offsets, because what for net zero you need is carbon removal offsets, but there's another much more common, much cheaper type of offset that you can get, which is called carbon avoidance offsets. And that is essentially, carbon avoidance is where you're investing in things that reduce the amount of carbon emissions going into the atmosphere, right? So you invest in solar farms, wind farms, clean fuel heating stoves, avoiding deforestation. There's various different carbon avoidance offsets that are on the market, but you can't use those ones for net zero because they don't actually remove any carbon emissions from the atmosphere. Like a solar farm doesn't do that. That's not its job. Whereas carbon removal are all of the things that actually suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So your trees, your seagrass, your peatland. And then there are some technologies that are doing this, but they are very expensive and currently doing a very, I think in total, the total amount of carbon removal that has happened through technology in all history so far has been the equivalent of about 7 hours worth of global emissions. So the technology is still trying to scale. So what you need to do to achieve net zero, and the way it's structured at the moment, is the best kind of standard for this is the Science Based Targets Initiative, which sets out that essentially what an organization needs to do is measure a baseline year. That baseline year, the earliest it can be is 2015. And so whenever you sort of measure your baseline carbon footprint, you have to then achieve at least a 90% reduction across scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, right? 90% reduction across all of those scopes. And that journey, you know, it's often presented as a lovely smooth line. It's not going to be a lovely smooth line. It's going to be a bit of a bumpy journey, right? Like you can see here, sometimes you're going to be ahead, sometimes you're going to be behind, and that's fine. That's part of what this journey is going to look like. But it's about achieving these kind of reductions over time and putting measures in place to do it. And part of that will be having a long-term target, which might be 2050 for you. It might be 2040 for you. It might be 2035 for you. If you want to be more ambitious, you know, your long-term target kind of dictates that. But then you should also be setting near-term targets. So for many organizations, they're setting near-term targets of 2030 or 2028, or, you know, those sorts of things around achieving like a 50% reduction by 2030. So that's what the net zero journey fundamentally looks like. And the way the Planet Mark certification program is structured for net zero and for organizations is that we're basically guiding organizations along this pathway and recognizing their progress along it. And so what this looks like is that when an organization starts with us, they start as a certified business. And this is where they're getting their measurement in order, right? And they start with scope 1 and 2 and a bunch of scope 3 measures that are generally easier to get hold of. Things like your business travel, things like waste, things like employee commuting. These are things that you generally have on hand because you're measuring them for your finance systems, and they're easier to get hold of than necessarily kind of trying to get data out of your supply chain and stuff like that. Then you start expanding your measurement, and once you get a full measurement in place, you can then unlock the ability to progress to net zero committed, because then we work with you to set targets and come up with a transition plan. And then once you've got all of, essentially net zero committed says you've measured everything you need to measure to set a proper baseline, and you are now committed to it because you've set targets and you've got a transition plan saying how you're going to do that. Then net zero aligned, what that will do is recognize that you are actually doing it. You've actually achieved your near-term target. You're doing what you said you would do, and you're aligned to your net zero journey. And then obviously net zero achieved will be the last stop on the journey. And I thoroughly look forward to giving out the first one of those. So this is kind of the journey that we take organizations on and help them kind of progressively make their way along the path in a way where it's structured, It's one step at a time. It helps you kind of take one bite of the elephant at a time, and have kind of confidence in the governance structure and in the checks that are being put in place around what you're doing. And so to share one example, Regular Cleaning, I don't know if anyone from Regular Cleaning is here. A couple of years ago, they won our Supply Chain Engagement Award because they had been getting into their supply chain and starting to really work with their suppliers on getting them, bringing them on the journey with them, and digging into this critical Scope 3 emissions category 1, which is the products and services that you buy. And so Regular Cleaning, they've kind of measured a full baseline of emissions. They're working on, they've sort of developed their transition plan against that, with kind of key actions and things that they're going to do and timelines against each of those. We've done energy savings opportunity scheme, ESOS audits of their sites to be able to work out where the energy savings and stuff are going to come from. And then they've been taking lots of action. So they've started to reduce their Scope 1 emissions through removing gas heating and installing new insulation in their headquarters. They've transitioned more than half of their vehicle fleet to electric, with charging points available at the offices for staff as well. And they've been able to make significant and substantial progress on their journey as a result. And so this is, Regular Cleaning is a good example. Hive Cleaning is another wonderful example. They won our best company last year. So there's quite a lot of good examples within the industry that I do thoroughly recommend you go and check out, because they all disclose information on their websites about what they've done and how they're doing it, and the steps they're taking. And a big part of what they're doing is they're looking for alternative products and things, eco-friendly products, recyclable products, ways to reduce the packaging associated with the products that they purchase. So these are the sorts of steps within the cleaning industry that we see kind of taking place. And so to round off and summarize, and before I pass across to Greg to talk more specifically about how you're going to go about gathering the data for these kind of specific things, net zero requires radical emission reductions, 90% plus by 2050 at the latest. It includes Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and it's this full suite of things. It involves near-term and long-term targets, and you're only allowed up to a maximum of 10% residual emissions being neutralized using carbon removal schemes, whereas compared to carbon neutrality basically says measure your footprint today, and then tomorrow if I measure 1,000-ton carbon footprint across my scopes of emissions, I just buy 1,000 tons of any type of offset, and hey presto, I'm carbon neutral. And so you can see that it's a very different ambition. And as I already said, we cannot plant enough trees to mitigate how much we're emitting at the moment. So we have to achieve the reductions. And so that's why there's been a crackdown quite a bit within the EU and the UK on the use of the word carbon neutral for talking about claims against particularly products, saying you can't call a product carbon neutral because it's misleading to consumers, because they did lots of surveys of consumers and they basically found that consumers didn't understand what carbon neutral meant. And when they found out and were told what it meant, they were always disappointed and felt it was misleading as a term. So that's why carbon neutrality has kind of fallen out of favor a fair amount, and net zero has been really kind of the journey that we are on. It's not that carbon neutrality is necessarily a bad thing. It can be a good step to take, but it should be a step on the journey to net zero. It's not an end destination in and of itself. And then finally, just to kind of say, so I've mentioned this SBTi already is a good place to look. There's also the ISO net zero guidelines as a very good framework to look at. And those guidelines are now being developed into a full ISO net zero standard that I expect will be fully published and out and in the public domain by the end of next year. But it should be coming out for public consultation, hopefully by the end of this year as well. And then also I recommend checking out the Race to Zero, which is the kind of UN-backed campaign for organizations of all sizes to kind of publicly disclose their net zero targets and be recognized for doing so. And so that's me. I will pass across to Greg to dig into more detail on, okay, how are you going to measure this?
Thank you, Andrew. So thanks so much, Andrew, and for everybody for being here. I'm going to briefly talk about calculating a carbon footprint. It is only 10 minutes, and naturally you can probably imagine it's going to be quite hard to describe it all in 10 minutes. And any of my colleagues on the call will also know that I'm happily to speak hours on this subject, so I'll try to keep it brief. Nero, very, very quickly, we're a small carbon consultancy. We've helped about 100 companies measure their carbon footprint in the 3 years that we've been around. We've measured today about 2.5 million tons of carbon every year, much of that now going into the reduction pathways that Andrew described, how they've done so successfully at Planet Mark. We've built some pretty good tools to measure carbon footprints and ultimately build that system to help you track and record and monitor it over the years to come. I don't need to go into detail about what is a carbon footprint. Thankfully, I assumed and guessed correctly that Andrew would go through that. And one of the things that Andrew also pointed out was, although it can look a bit hairy, all these areas of the carbon footprint, for most businesses, particularly those on the call now, many of those categories will not be relevant. So even just very immediately, we can shave off some of that work by assessing which categories are going to be relevant or not. When we try to put the stages of a footprint together, and we summarize those in key steps, and there are dozens and dozens of steps, but when we try to summarize it simply, what we do at Nero, it will be exactly the same, almost identical to what Planet Mark do, and many consultants and anyone administering these types of carbon footprints will be something very similar to this. So it will be defining the organizational boundaries. So many of you will be quite complex companies, so just determining which companies make up that group, which facilities, defining the base year and reporting year that we need to measure. Conducting a screening exercise very early on is key to quickly seeing where your hotspots are with the emissions. We then want to define the operational boundaries of that footprint. So really sort of having a checklist of everything that's made up within the carbon footprint. And then we can move on to data collection. And then that's then calculated into emissions, all within a quality management system, ultimately then ending in the GHG reporting, carbon footprint reporting, which will then go on to be published, to be verified by bodies like Interface. And so if I just spend a couple of minutes on a few of those key steps, so that organizational boundary process is a key early step. So no doubt many of you belong to groups, maybe many of you are multinationals, and you could be doing things at a local level or country level. And so it's determining which companies are doing what very early on and recording how you're going to capture those entities within that boundary. So do you control those companies? Is it based on equity share? And then you eventually just end up with this map of all the different individual components of the organization. We always recommend a screening exercise, first of all, because this is relatively simple to do. So it's a high level emissions mapping exercise. We categorize all of the suppliers that you spend money with. And you sort of pointed out about everything upstream, it's everything you pay for. Ultimately, most parts of your footprint is what you pay for as a business, other than those few categories and downstream, which you don't physically pay for. So we know all of your emissions are locked within your financial accounts. And so if we can tag them early on with their relevance, so that would be key material suppliers, of course, relevant. HMRC, not going to be relevant to the footprint. We can tag them by category, make sure we tag them by the SIC code that's both attributed to them. And then very quickly, we can apply the average emission factors based on spend to all of that spend. So we then get this heat map, identifying hotspots of key suppliers, key material groups, and then we have the data to decide, okay, well, clearly we're not going to bother with 80% of our suppliers, which might make up 3% of our carbon footprint projection. But we have highlighted that our biggest areas are these 50 suppliers, these key material inputs. Let's focus and prioritize those, converting that spend now into mass, into volume, and starting to identify which suppliers that we want to reach out to start requesting specific information. And with the screening exercise, one thing that you will need to do, that we would always encourage to do, is to have that operational boundary where you can have a list of all the relevant activities to your footprint, group it by scope and category, and it effectively acts as a recipe. So we know the biggest obstacle for all of our clients, and every client and every person, company trying to do a carbon footprint, is ambiguity. And often it's so mystifying how much you need to put into the footprint, that a lot of companies just don't do it. But if you have a very clear, succinct recipe list of everything that goes into that footprint, you as a company and your colleagues and any consultants that you might work with can very clearly work through that list to make sure that every year you're putting the same data into that assessment. And also it means that when colleagues that might be managing the process move on to other companies and whatever reason they might have, that whole process can clearly be tracked, and a lot of that knowledge doesn't then get lost with that individual that might have been responsible for it. Sometimes use calculator system over carbon system over a carbon calculator because it is a system that you need to have, and whether it's one that you've developed internally, many companies are more than capable of doing this if they've got the resource and capabilities, or whether you are using a third-party consultant, Planet Mark, Nero, or one of the hundreds that are around in the recent years. Having a really robust calculator system is key to this. It ensures accuracy, so the emissions are quantified correctly using reliable data and methodologies. Its completeness, so all relevant scopes and sources are captured, which we would have determined in previous steps. And it's transparent, so the assumptions and exclusions and data sources are clearly documented. And we can then apply everything consistently. So the methods are applied uniformly over time with valid comparisons, and the system supports business goals and informed decision making. So when verification bodies like Interface that Ryan's going to go into that process, they need to see this system. They need to see that it's being tracked, not just the calculations, but our quality management, our reason for choosing the base year, any base year recalculations, which are very, very typical, that you might need to recalculate the base year when the data becomes available, tracking your electricity tariffs and emission factors and customer emission factors and production targets and KPIs. That all needs to go into a really robust system, which makes sure that it's aligned with the verification process, but also internally, you've got a much better grasp on how you're managing these emissions. So whatever system that you use, it's clearly got to be verifiable, which when we come to talk about in the Q&A about what sort of clients and customers and stakeholders are expecting, key to that is transparency and making sure that we are publishing not only good quality footprints, but we're being honest and open about those footprints. They're never going to be perfect, and there is no such thing as a perfect carbon footprint. I think every consultant can testify to that. It's just the nature of carbon footprints. You cannot scientifically make it perfect. And that's often a big barrier, that people will often let perfection get in the way of a very, very good carbon footprint. So the steps: start simple, start now. For many of you, I don't know how many of you have started a carbon footprint, but now is the best time to start it. Demand from stakeholders is only going to go up. Don't be put off by certain governmental leaders around the world that might not be very aligned with our sort of net zero ambitions. It's just, that's only going to be temporary, and the demand from brands and customers is not going away. Using the best available data, so don't let gaps or estimates stop progress. Document assumptions clearly, be transparent, explaining the boundaries and exclusions, and then every year they will improve these footprints. So each year your footprint will get stronger as your data systems and supplier engagement improves as well. Setting near-term targets is really important initially as well, and make sure that you're meeting the standards. Andrew said about carbon neutrality and the risk of greenwash accusations around that, and it's completely true that you need to make sure that you're reporting your carbon footprint in line with GHG protocol, in line with the ISO standards, to make sure it is robust and consistent and credible. And then when it comes to scope 3, many of you are not going to be able to do a single thing about scope 3 just yet, apart from a few categories like maybe business travel, with some of your business travel decisions with commuting, with traveling by train rather than by car or plane, etc. But most of your materials you're not going to be able to influence just yet. And so it's about starting small, making sure that you're having the conversations with suppliers about what they are doing, and just having those conversations with them early on. And then don't go alone. Use sector guidance, peer support, trusted consultants, association bodies like we're talking about today. There is lots of help out there, and there's lots of great information online about how to start conducting these carbon footprints. So that's the 10-minute overview of conducting the carbon footprint. There's lots more of course, information around with some of the methodologies, but hopefully within the Q&A section, we'll get an opportunity to answer any more specific questions about that process. So I think I'll pass over to Ryan then to talk about the verification process.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you also, Andrew. I can't promise to be as eloquent as both of the previous presenters, but I'll try my best. I've only got a few minutes to run through the case for why verify. Obviously, I've already been introduced, but my name is Ryan, one of the directors for Interface NRM. We are a certification and verification body working with international standards. Just a quick shout out to Joel as well at Northwood, who made the introduction to the CHSA, put our name in the frame to take part in this. So we've been working with them on their verification of their carbon footprint. So thank you to Joel for that. So what I'm going to try and cover quickly in the few minutes I've got is just, the case for verification, why you should verify, and what verification is broadly as well. If I don't kind of answer all the questions, we don't get through as much as you'd want today, feel free to just reach out directly. Equally, I think we've got a webinar coming up next week, which will be a more extensive session all around calculation and verification that Interface is hosting. So again, feel free to drop me a line. I can hook you up with that as well. So let's jump in. So first and foremost, I guess, what is verification? I think kind of self-explanatory, but the verification process is the process of evaluating historical information to determine it is materially correct and it conforms to a given criteria. Essentially, what we're doing is we're checking what sits behind the numbers of your footprint. So you go through the process with the likes of Greg, and you get to the end of the process, and you've got your carbon footprint. And what we do is then we backtrack through that process to make sure that what's been published is accurate and correct. We do that, as you can see on the logo on the screen there. We do that to an international standard, ISO 14064, which is for the quantification. It's directed at an organizational level, and being an international standard, and being that we're accredited to verify to that standard by UCAS, both of those two things that would sit on that report and on the associated certificate give a certain level of credibility to the outputs, I would say, something that's a bit more recognizable and widely accepted for being consistent. The process of verification is pretty similar, I would say, to any other audit process you've been through. As I say, we're looking at how you got to what you got to. We're following some evidence trails from those outputs back through all the different inputs, just checking that the methodology and the calculations are materially correct. With Interface, I think you'll find that, as opposed to working with any of our competitors, is we always try to work with you on your compliance journeys. We don't aim to be the auditing company that comes in and makes you cry as part of the process. We want to work with you on continually improving either your certification or your verification journeys, so you feel like you're getting something out of the process as well there. We do that through raising any sort of opportunities for improvement, things to consider as you move forward. So you can start your verification journey right at the very start, like that roadmap that there's different roadmaps and different compliance journeys that have been demonstrated previously. We can come in and verify that at any point, and part of that process then is getting another third party, another person's input on how you can improve on that and how you can progress that appropriately. But the verification process is pretty simple, two-step process: pre-verification followed by verification. If any of you have been through ISO certification, very similar to a stage 1, stage 2 process, essentially looking at the footprint in a broad sense initially, with the pre-verification, looking to set up, the verifier will look to set up their evidence gathering plan, what they're going to be looking for, where they're going to be looking, that sort of thing, and kind of giving you a heads up on that. But equally at the same time, kind of conducting a gap analysis, as it were. So you kind of have that those early warning shots on anywhere that might cause an issue in the verification, and giving you kind of the best chance of success. So now we sort of know what verification is. Why should you verify is the sort of the main question. I think that comes down to 3 primary reasons, and I can think of. There's probably a lot more, but and they are assurance, compliance, and improvement. Going through the verification process, in this case, to ISO 14064. With a UCAS accredited body, it gives you the assurance that those outputs are essentially accurate, like I've said. There's always the opportunity, the danger, I suppose, of working with this much data and this many data points, that you can kind of almost get too close to the data. You can't see the wood for the trees, sort of thing, and it's hard to spot where those errors might be. Putting it through a third party who's running it through and just going through that process of how did you get here, what did you do, where's the input, following those evidence trails, gives you confidence, and gives your suppliers and any other interested parties confidence that overall output is going to be materially accurate. Obviously, all of that then builds to a certain level of credibility and trust within your supply chains. Mitigates a lot of risk, as was said previously, to risks around greenwashing and the like. If you've got something like a 14064 certification to fall back on to say we've had this data verified, it really cuts out those risks, and it can also cut out a lot of the questions as well when you sort of slap that carbon footprint down in front of a supplier who's asked for it, and they kind of look at those numbers and go, how did you get there? What did you do here? What did you do there? A lot of the time, if you're putting that in front of them with those marks, ISO 14064, then they're aware that you've gone through the process to an international standard and you've had it verified by a UCAS accredited certification body. Hopefully, at that point, they shouldn't have too many more questions. Compliance. So I think it's been mentioned in the chat a couple of times, and in the previous presenters. There's a lot of companies obviously have to comply to various pieces of legislation like the SECR or the emissions trading schemes. Something that you have to do when you hit a certain size. Aligning those processes to 14064 gives you a nice consistent approach to that reporting. And helps you kind of as well, coming out of it with the process with a certificate in your hand, helps you to kind of get something out of a process that you have to do, something a bit more valuable. Equally, going through the process of aligning your greenhouse gas inventory management to 14064 helps with scoring and the like toward tenders and frameworks, and you should see improved scores relating to that. An improvement. So verification will help you. Like I said, we take the view of working with you on your carbon footprinting journey, but equally the going through the process itself, just naturally, you're going to identify any gaps, any errors, and it's going to help you to improve your overall environmental performance through that process. With the verified data, you're going to stand on kind of firmer ground for setting reduction targets and making more reasoned decisions to where you're going to be able to concentrate your efforts to make the most impact. And again, working with ISO, UCAS, kind of those credible, well-known marks and names brings with it sort of a sense of prestige and the like, and hopefully opens up other market opportunities, improving scores in the tender environments where these things are being asked for more and more, maybe not explicitly for a given sort of certification process or route. I don't think the market's necessarily settled on a given approach, but it tends to be, if you look back in, I take things like ISO 9001 as an example. It wasn't a million years ago that people were asking all the quality management questions, and then they landed on, well, actually, it'd be a lot easier if everyone just had ISO 9001 certification, so let's just ask them for that. And you can make the assumption that hopefully these supply chains and the like will land on a very similar process with carbon, wanting to see that you've got an ISA, an international certification to do with your carbon accounting, so that they can trust the data that you're providing to them. Like I say, it was a pretty brief whistle-stop tour, and I was definitely less coherent than the last two presenters, but I hope I've given you kind of a brief case for why you should verify. If you've got any further questions or anything, do feel free to drop me an email, give us a call, and we can try and handle those appropriately. Any that we don't handle now with questions and answers.
I forgot to shout out Joel at Northwood as well, so sorry about that, Joel, if you're on. So thanks for organising and getting Ryan and I involved in this too. And Four Stones as well, if you're on this call as well, another client of Nero.
Thank you very much, everyone, for those presentations. We've had a variety of questions coming through the chat and the QA, some of which you've been answering as you go along. I'm now getting a couple of questions about whether or not we're going to be sharing the slides. Just so everyone knows, there's a recording of the webinar, and we will be sharing that on the CHSA website, so obviously the slides will be accessible through that. But Greg, Andrew and Ryan, are you happy for us to share the slides as well with the audience after the fact? So hopefully that should be okay. We'll do that to everyone who's been registered. We've had some questions in advance which we'll take now, and there is some overlap with some of the questions that have been posted on the Q&A and the chat. Just to flag, we'll compile all of those and we will circulate those again so they're accessible and easy to get to for everybody. The first question that we've had in advance is, I'd like to request that calculators, formulas and tools are shared across the CHSA to create a supportive compliance approach cohesively. Is this something that can be developed and shared? Do you want to answer that, Lorcan, on behalf of the CHSA?
Yeah, I think this is where our members should engage with a consultancy body like you see here today to get engaged and calculate. We in the CHSA won't be getting into that level of detail, I think is fair to say, Kathy. I think as this grows and matures, it's something down the road we could incorporate into our schemes, but I think it's still people are doing it two different ways and there's no consistency. So I think as it matures is something we look at down the line.
Okay, thank you. We've had a question in the chat and the Q&A about which emission factor database would be recommended. We've also had a question in advance that says, once an organisation has accounted for their scopes 1, 2 and 3 emissions per product to move to full life cycle assessment, how would the CHSA advise a uniform approach to the calculation per product category for the life cycle assessment? I don't know if that's Andrew and Greg might be the best place to answer that.
Happy to jump in. I think the product life cycle assessments, basically you go through an evolution when you're measuring carbon generally as an organization, right? Getting your own house in order and understanding the emissions that you are directly causing and that you have greatest control over is the place where most organizations can start. When they're getting into their supply chain and understanding the products that they're buying and those sorts of impacts, they often start with a spend-based approach, and where they're looking at, okay, so this sort of partly helps answer your question, Colin, in the chat as well, around how do we measure the scope 3 emissions of suppliers if they don't give us data? Well, you start with a spend-based approach. You know how much you spend on the product, and there are lots of emissions factor databases available which have said per £100 that you spend on buying paper, it equals X amount of carbon, right? Based on academic studies and research, comparisons of products and things out there that allow you to get an assessment of your supply chain carbon footprint quite quickly and easily, because all you need to know is what products you purchased and how much it costed. And so you start with that, and that's an estimation, right? And it's crude and it's not perfect, but it's a good place to start. And then you start getting into activity-based data where you're understanding exactly what type of product it was. So was it recycled paper? Was it was it forestry, you know, from a good forestry certified source? Those sorts of questions. And how did it travel to you? Where did it come from? Those sorts of activity-based things then allow you to get more information. But the critical thing to remember here is that measurement is not being done for measurement's sake. Measurement is there to inform and enable decision making, and to inform and enable reductions ultimately being achieved. So we will never be here to tell you, oh, you must, you know, crack a whip over everything to get every single piece of data perfect. That's not the point. As Greg said, there is no perfect carbon footprint. The point is it should enable you to make decisions, to make choices, to and to understand where the emissions in your carbon footprint are coming from, because this is an issue that isn't going away. Right, this, you know, unless your stance is I don't believe climate change is real, which I would be impressed at. This is a kind of a shock that is coming for industry, and the businesses that innovate is much like kind of the digital transformation, right? Businesses that said I'm going to stay on paper and I'm not going to do any of this digital stuff, funnily enough, went out of business because it was a transformation that kind of overtook industries and kind of reshaped how lots and lots and lots of things work. Climate change isn't going to be much different to that, because climate change, you know, the digital transformation was driven by pure economics. The climate change transition will be driven by economics, because a lot of the changes that you're going to make will save you money, right? Do you want to spend less money on waste? Yes. Do you want to spend less money on resources by using some of your waste as a resource, circular economy? Yes. Do you want to spend less money on energy? Yes. Like, renewable energy is now definitively cheaper than fossil fuels. No matter what anyone says, that is what is true. The reason our energy prices have shot up so much are because of the price of gas, not because of the price of renewable energy at all. And the insecurity in the price of gas because of what's going on in Russia, the Ukraine and Iran. And so, you know, this is kind of cascading through supply chains. And I mentioned someone asked in the chat for me to share the slide about this kind of cascade coming through supply chains, and there's this slide that we've got from the UK Net Zero Census that we ran last year, and this is a project that we do in partnership with the DESNZ Net Zero Council. It's the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. It's chaired by Ed Miliband, and so this is kind of the biggest data gathering exercise done in the UK to understand where UK industry is on net zero. Over 2,000 organisations participated last year, including more than 1,000 SMEs. More than half the sample were small and medium-sized businesses. And overall, we found that 46% of organisations had been asked for carbon data by a customer in the last 12 months. And that included 37% of SMEs. More than a third of SMEs had been asked for carbon data. And at the moment, there's no regulatory requirement for an SME to measure and disclose carbon emissions at a national level. But there's this cascade effect happening where, because SMEs form quite a large part of the Scope 3 emissions of large organisations, the large organisations have to report. In order for them to report on what they need to report for their carbon footprint, they have to ask the SMEs for carbon data. So there's this cascade effect coming down through supply chains, which means that if you haven't been asked for carbon data by one of your customers in the last 12 months, I would be kind of shocked if you aren't in the next 12 months. And for point of reference, we are, and you can see here that different sectors get more affected. So 51% of manufacturers were asked for carbon data, 64% of IT and communication, 54% of transport, logistics and storage for those who are in kind of the distributor mode. So if you're more B2B, you're much more likely to find these requests coming your way. And it's worth noting that we're now in the 4-week window where we're gathering data for the UK Net Zero Census again. Big campaign being backed by all of the different trade associations, CBI, Make UK, British Chambers of Commerce, etc., 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 etc. So you can go to netzerocensus.co.uk. It takes 5 minutes. And so if you want your views to be heard on net zero, around where you are on your journey, what barriers you see coming for you, what opportunities you see, what support you need to get you to help you move further, go and fill it out there, because this is what data gets fed directly into government to kind of parlay with them around what industry needs.
Can we pause there, Andrew? Just try to squeeze in some more questions, Kathy,
Yeah.
there.
Another question here. Are the speakers seeing any trends as to what the majority of suppliers and customers across the industry are requiring to demonstrate sustainability/carbon reduction today, and how may this change in the future?
I think I'll start on that one if you don't mind. So I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are lots of negative influences at government level that just say very stupid things. But I think the majority of suppliers and customers, they are expecting carbon disclosure data, because you will, as Andrew said, increasingly be asked for. If you haven't already, customers will say, "Dear supplier, please tell us your carbon emissions in 2024 that we were responsible for. Thanks very much. Can you send it by Friday? Otherwise, we're not going to work with you ever again." That's quite extreme, but it has happened. And we work with lots of printers, and naturally lots of brands work with commercial printers. It's a relatively homogenized sort of industry, and there are lots of quite short-term decisions being made about carbon disclosure. If you don't have the information, you will lose business because of that, because those suppliers, those customers will have their own procurement policies, they have their own science-based targets. So initially, you need to make sure that you've got that carbon information to hand. That can come in a simplistic form where you've done your full carbon footprint and you know how much income that you've had as a business. And so you can work out an intensity ratio. For every £1 million of income, your emissions were 250 tons of carbon. So if a customer says we spent £500,000 with you, you can give them a very quick estimate if your product mix is pretty sort of similar across the board. I think the question that Nick Winstone originally asked about sort of product footprinting is then the next level, where you can then make a more specific carbon footprint disclosure about the products that you've sold to that customer, something that Nero and Northwood have worked on a lot with all their products. And the key to that is making sure that they are comparable, and they will never be comparable. And there's always a risk that your suppliers, many of you will be competitors, you'll supply a product footprint that says your product is 300 kilograms per ton, and then a competitor's might be 450 kilograms per ton. And there is a risk that customers make short-term decisions based on that top trump style, and they don't then get the full picture, which might be the categories aren't comparable, or maybe actually the higher carbon footprint right now has got validated and very, very credible carbon reduction plan in place that by 2030, its product carbon footprint is going to be half of the original one. And then the other one, which is right now lower, hasn't got any reduction plans in place. And so by that, it's just looking at timescales, and there's a real risk there that customers do make those short-term decisions. So what the trends are, making sure that you've got disclosure, making sure that you have credible carbon reduction plans in place, ideally through SBTi, but that's also a barrier because of the costs, but certainly aligning with the net zero standard of SBTi, which is still the best standard to define it. And ultimately just making sure that the information is transparent, that if customers are tempted to compare, at least they've got then the details of those footprints to look at them slightly more critically.
Anything else, Kathy, there?
Yeah, there's in the last few minutes, maybe there's a question here that's talking, essentially talking about where to go for reference materials. It's looking about it's essentially saying, how do you prove that you're making to your customers that you're making a sustained commitment to this, and where do you go for reference materials? And that kind of echoes a question we've had in the chat just now as well, which goes back to, I think when Andrew was talking about estimating the calculations, where do you go to get any kind of framework for estimating those calculations?
Is that Ryan? Is that your territory?
I think that
Ryan?
might be Greg or Andrew, to be honest. But
Andrew,
it might
I'll let you go first, just in order, and I can always add anything to it.
Cool. So I've referenced in the chat. So ultimately, quite often, so there are a couple of resources I'm going to point people to. So first of all, I recommend checking out UK Business Climate Hub. It's specifically for SMEs. It is a government-backed, government-supported portal for SMEs to get information about net zero. And there are a couple of free carbon calculator tools on there that you can make use of as an SME that will help you get going and get started. So worth checking out UK Business Climate Hub. I'll stick the link to that in the chat. As you progress, it's likely that you might need a little bit more help, and or you might find that your customer is requiring that your data has been validated by someone, i.e. you can't just have measured it yourself. And And so particularly when you get into things like Colin has referenced the NHS supply chain. The NHS supply chain is part of what the public procurement sort of requirements, and the specific piece of legislation is PPN 006. And so I've provided the link to that in the chat. That sets out, if you're involved in public procurement, PPN 006 says what the government wants to see from suppliers in order for them to be approved as a supplier, which is typically for larger contracts, but you might be part of larger contracts, or on the, you might be a supplier to someone on a larger contract who then needs certain information from you. But there's more information at that there. And then finally, I've also stuck in the chat a link to a report that was published last week during London Climate Action Week, which is a proposed voluntary standard for SME reporting on this. And this is, the EU already has a piece of guidance like this. It's called VSME, voluntary SME, sort of sustainability standard. The UK is now basically developing one, and that's what this report is proposing. And it sets out kind of a consistent format and structure that the intention is, it's not going to become mandatory from government, at least immediately. The goal is to basically try and standardize the asks that SMEs are receiving from larger corporates to say, give us this data in this format. And that is, you produce that kind of a set of reporting once, and then just give the same thing to everybody is the objective of this kind of exercise. But we are now in public consultation mode on this draft standard.
Yeah, and I think the GHG protocol too, the scope 3 calculation guidance is very, very good. Their original carbon accountancy sort of framework for scope 1 and scope 2 is desperately old now, and it's quite sort of just an old looking document, but their scope 3 guidance is particularly sort of good, and it's very readable for even companies and individuals that are new to it. So still read that, because it is easy to digest. And then when it comes to credibility of reporting, other disclosure platforms, CDP is particularly sort of very good for making sure there is a uniform disclosure sort of framework that you're publishing then publicly, and then the verification component as well, that very, very few companies have got verification to 14064 by verification bodies with the sufficient UCAS accreditation like Interface have. And so getting that accredited can be really sort of key difference, because there are lots and lots of dodgy carbon footprints that might say that they've captured purchased goods and services. So at a summary level, you can see purchased goods and services as being accounted for, but what you might not then see is they've only accounted for £4 million worth of spend in that category compared to maybe £20 million worth of relevant spend. And it's very, very, very difficult to then compare like for like if they've missed out marketing spend and administrative expenditure, data centers, and maybe they've only captured cost of sales, so paper, plastic, and other key materials. And so it's really hard to compare. And hopefully the documentation that Andrew and the team's been working on is going to also cover specific activities within those categories that should make the requirement of a sort of standardized footprint report.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's just really important. Sorry, just jump in there on the last point. It's really important as early as you can is to align with those international standards, because essentially all these supply chains and everything are international. And while there's a million different documents and schemes and the like out there that you can try and align with, the sooner you align with those international standards, which is where anything is going to eventually land, the better. So working with somebody like Greg, who's aligned all his calculation like to 14064, I'm sure Positive Planet have done Planmark have done the same. So it's very important from the outset, while the supply chain may not be demanding 14064 right now, to begin on your journey with 14064 in mind, I would say, because it makes sense that that's where it's going to land eventually.
Good. Any more? Are we out of time, Kathy, or is there anything more we can squeeze in?
We're on time now. What we'll do is, if there are any questions in the chat or the Q&A that have not been addressed or that were sent through in advance that have not been addressed, we'll put them as part of a Q&A that we'll publish in the next week or two once we've had a chance to compile it.
Great. Okay. Well, it just leaves me to thank the presenters, Ryan, Greg, and Andrew today. Excellent session. And you can see by the numbers that have been on and the questions and the quality, it was very well received. So thank you very much for your contribution.